Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University. And I'm going to give a talk on the past and future of the global city mission movement. This is a talk that I'm giving at the City Mission Movement UK conference in November 2025. And just a little bit of my background. I grew up poor. Most of my friends were getting addicted or going to jail in high school. My drug of choice was workaholism. That took me to MIT. I was there during the dot-com boom. I co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet before kind of having a life burnout and realizing my heart was for God and the poor. So I started up an organization, a ministry to essentially serve the poor and use technology to do that. Part of what brought my passion for that was actually getting connected with the City Mission movement. I did summer staff at City Union Mission in Kansas City in 1992. And then I worked a summer in Cape Town City Mission in Cape Town, South Africa in 1993. And I've stayed connected with the movement ever since then, so for over 30 years. And the history of City Vision University is it was originally founded as the education arm of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, now the Citygate Network. It was originally headquartered in Kansas City. That's how I got connected back then. But the school was founded in 98 to train rescue mission and city mission workers. It became independent in 2008, shortly after getting accredited. But our mission really is we're an accredited online university that is by city missions for city missions. More than 80% of our students are in rescue missions or city mission-like ministries. Now, the real focus of my talk, and this is really one of my life passions, what I feel like God's put me here on earth for, is to talk about this Kairos moment, God-ordained time of transformation and opportunity that we're living in right now. And these are some of my life verses. So, how can we be like the sons of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do? First Chronicles 12:32. I hear a verse like that and I'm like, man, that's what I want to learn to do. And how do we discern what God's doing? Like Jesus did whenever he said that he did what he saw the Father doing. I think that Jesus was observing the things that God was doing, and he's like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So that's what he said in John 5:19. And then you have in Isaiah 43:19, see, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. And then in Esther 4:14, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So I've spent a good part of my life trying to discern how do you do this. I started doing this actually in the internet world and working for venture capitalists, trying to discern more in the natural and using technology. But I've since adapted that into the ministry world. So that's really what this talk is about. How do we do that for the city mission movement? So in the world of innovation, you have these innovation curves. So you have an innovation that takes off, and then over time, it's going to peak, and then it starts to decline unless you have this thing that is a new wineskin, a recontextualization. And I think that we're in a Kairos moment right now where we're trying to do that from the historical city mission movement to the emerging city mission movement. And to do that well, this is extremely difficult and dangerous. So we have to combine tradition, and really that's founded in the Bible. The foundation is in the Bible and in theology, but it really helps to understand the history of the city mission movement. And then look at innovation. So look at emerging trends and models in the city mission movement. Now, what I've seen is that the innovation people like to get together in a group, and the tradition people like to get in a group and they like to throw bombs at each other. And the reality is we have to have dual expertise. We need to have both of these and hold on to both at the same time. And that's really what I've tried to do here at City Vision. One of our core missions is doing that and really doing a deep dive on that. So we have something called the City Mission History Project, history newsletter, podcast, AI archive, and I'll show what that is in just a minute. And we have about 600 partner meetings with city missions and rescue missions and similar organizations. We're doing all sorts of research using AI. We're establishing best practices through our newsletter and podcast, and we've compiled a database of all the city missions in the world. So let me just show you a little bit of what that looks like so you can actually see some of these things. So if you go to our website, cityvision.edu, and you go for organizations, you can see this free rescue mission staff training. I have to apologize. In the U.S., we use the U.S. term, which is rescue missions, but here we use the city mission term. You know, Americans have to rename everything. Um, and we have a lot of different resources. So one of the things we've done is we've been starting to compile all the books that we can find, and we're digitizing these, and we're making them available through AI archive. We're making podcast recordings available to them, and pretty soon we'll have over 100 books. And this is really the largest collection of city mission history that's ever really been compiled. So you can see this in our archive. So we have this rescue mission history and values, where we have over 281 sources, and you can ask it basically anything you want. You can create audio overviews, and we provide this on our website. So if you go to the AI archive, you can get access to that. And then we also have a newsletter, and we'd love to add you guys to this newsletter. We're not trying to really sell anything on this. Right now, what we're trying to do is to compile our research and make it available. So these 5 waves of the history that I'm going to talk about, we're actually rolling out some of our research on that right now in the newsletter. And then if you're someone who doesn't like to read but you want to listen, we have a podcast. You can look this up. If you have a smartphone, you can just look it up, type in Rescue Mission Report, and you can use it for whatever podcast player you have. We also have toolkits. So if you go down here, you can see we have all sorts of toolkits that have a lot of material that's useful for, we've collected from partners, all sorts of, different things from partners. And then we have, we have these toolkits that we just have all these documents, different, HR templates, social enterprise templates. And then we've compiled this directory. At this point, I think we have about 566 different missions. And we want your help to continue to build this. And you can see we have a good number of missions. We're trying to collect data, different budget size. So you can see, we did our homework, and I've read about almost all your missions to try to, better understand what you're doing. So we've compiled all this research together to try to combine the tradition and the innovation together. And really what we're trying to do is to try to figure out what causes organizational and movement decline, and then how do we get this next thing to happen. So this has been one of the areas of study, one of the things I teach on in organizational studies. If you look at what causes organizational and movement decline, organizations decline, and I'll unpack this a little bit more, when their theological vision and strategy become misaligned with their context and audience. So the idea is you're built for a certain context, and if that context changes, then you're not going to work as effectively, and that's essentially what happens. So to put this in organizational terms, so you have your strategy and method, so funding, programs, systems, policies, culture, and at the core you have this thing that I'm going to explain what theological vision is. And what happens is the world changes around you, and there's growing misalignment. And what happens is you have decreasing effectiveness over time. So what needs to happen is this recontextualization. Now, if you look at the different Christian models of recontextualization, especially for post-Christian context, because I know that in the UK, that's a big thing that you guys are dealing with. Probably the best known model for recontextualization right now for the post-Christian context is Tim Keller's Centered Church. So Tim Keller, he founded a church in Manhattan, an evangelical church in Manhattan, and that's a very post-Christian context. And he was able to get that church to be very successful, and then he started a network called the City to City Network that has since planted over 1,600 churches, mostly in post-Christian context. And what he said in his model is there's 3 things. You got your doctrinal foundation and what to believe, and that's your core theology. And this should never change. And I'll talk about the theological streams within the city mission movement a little bit later. But the idea is you shouldn't be changing this. That's like changing religion. So this shouldn't change. But you use practical theology to get to this thing called theological vision. And that's the way he describes that as a faithful reinstatement of the gospel with rich implications for life, ministry, and mission in a particular culture at a moment of history. And a key part of that is what are your unique priorities and emphases, other things, mission, vision, values, ministry DNA, philosophy of ministry, and nonprofit terms. They call that theory of change. And this needs to be recontextualized over time. So that's how to see. And then the next part is what to do. So this is, I'm sure a lot of you have said the message doesn't change, but the methods do, right? So that's ministry expression. So it's how the gospel is expressed in a ministry in one community at a point of time. And there's 4 components I usually put in that are part of your strategy programs: culture and staffing, systems and policies, and funding model. And the idea around recontextualization is that we have to get these to work effectively. And that requires a lot of innovation, both in how we frame things. So that's innovation in framing, but also innovation in our methods. So most of my talk is going to be talking about the 5 historical waves of the city mission movement. And the 5 waves were starting with city mission societies that started at the same time as the early city missions. But I'm going to explain why I think those deserve to be viewed as different waves. And then there's the wave in the United States, independent gospel rescue missions. And, in America, we recontextualized. We created a new theological vision, new methods. But now there's these global and national networks, and that's really the wave that we're in right now. And we're approaching a 5th wave mission movement. So how do we recontextualize for that? So I have spent a lot of time. I've probably read and gone into more history books on the city mission movement than anyone I've met, close to 100 at this point. So I have been passionate about learning, what's happening. I'm in the middle of writing a book about kind of these things. So if you look at the history of innovation in the city mission movement, it all starts, we're not building on a 200-year history. We're building on a 2,000-year history of the parachurch. But what happened is, with the Protestant Reformation, a lot of the parachurch concepts were kind of thrown out because Luther didn't really like monasteries, and for a lot of good reasons. But that's where a lot of the parachurch concepts were. So we kind of had to reinvent the parachurch. So, and where that came from was actually we borrowed a lot of the innovations that came out of the original volunteer society. So the first volunteer society was the London Royal Society that really sparked the scientific revolution. And there were really 3 innovations. So voluntary membership, privately funded organization that was independently governed. Now, these don't seem revolutionary, but creating sizable organizations that had that was revolutionary. So from the volunteer societies, then the first real Christian counterpart for that was really significant was the foreign missionary society. So that started the foreign missions movement with William Carey. And then you had the idea of, hey, if we can do this foreign, why don't we do this domestic? So then you had domestic missionary societies. Now, all that's interesting because you have to understand that's the actual foundation that city mission societies were created on. So in the city mission societies, like if you look at the theological foundation for the city mission movement, there's a lot of different people out there on the UK side. You have Chalmers and Ewing, and really there was a few different things that they laid some innovations down. So lay volunteer driven, trained clergy led, a comprehensive safety net, interdenominational, holistic practical religion, evangelical revivalism, and diaconal parish visitation. So these were all innovations that that they had been starting to do, and this was also copied in German by Wickner, and they called these intermissions, was their kind of counterpart to the city mission societies. And in many ways, you can kind of think of this phase as analogy of the wave 1, the city mission society is the first attempts at flying. So they're trying to figure out how do you invent this thing that ultimately we now call the city mission. So the city mission movement, everyone knows, goes back to David Naismith in Glasgow, 1826. And really, he had 3 innovations that were essential to get the airplane to fly and to make it so that everyone could replicate it to get an airplane to fly. Number 1 was, he said, you have to have paid full-time lay missionaries. Before it was lay volunteer driven, and that just wasn't enough. The other thing was it was working class leadership. And you can see I put the word to here and with. So this was ministry to the poor. This was kind of, largely highly educated, whereas this became ministry with the poor. It was working class folks working with the poor. The other thing is it created more focused programs. And the German counterpart here is the Stadtmissions that were founded, later. But the idea is you're not going to say that, okay, there's all these things that city mission societies did, and you're going to narrow it down. And what you see here is the biplane, and just about everyone's following similar models. And the models of the airplane don't look so different because you got a proven model. So that's really wave two of the mission movement. And then in waves 3 and 4, you get the gospel rescue mission movement. And really, so Jerry McAuley in 1872, he had some key innovations there. And number one was a focus on the destitute, not just the poor, but on the poorest of the poorest of the poor. And that's where the term rescue comes from. American evangelical revivalism had its own flavor, especially, with the different revivals that were going on, the Second Great Awakening. And then the third thing that was different is the rescue mission movement. A lot of the key leaders, like Jerry McAuley, they were indigenous leadership of the poor. And if you follow missiology, that makes a big difference in how effectively things work. Now, you have other groups like the Salvation Army that are following a similar model. You have, over time, now you have all these different groups. So you have the independent city missions, so CMM-UK's in that. You have different independent missions in Europe, Australia, and Africa. But then you have these other models centralized that are, in a lot of ways similar to the Salvation Army. So Mission Australia is one of the biggest in that. And then you have others that are called quasi-governmental stat missions. And here's what's interesting in this is these different groups you can kind of organize by theological stream. So the independent city missions and gospel rescue missions are kind of in this independent stream. So they're evangelical, but they're free church, meaning that they're not going to be government affiliated. They're not going to be a government sponsored church. And they're non-denominational. They generally are decentralized associations, and they have limited or no government funding. Whereas the centralized model, in theological terms, you call that the Episcopal polity. And a lot of times there's significant government funding ranging from, maybe 10 to 20% to 70%. And at least in the Salvation Army, you have huge Wesleyan holiness influence theologically. And then with this stream, there's a lot of Lutheran influence, and that really affects a lot of the different, continental European missions. But a lot of those became state-sponsored and centralized, and in many parts, they're a part of the state-sponsored church, and they're actually a social service arm of the government. So there's these different branches out there. And then now I think that there is an emerging branch that I think needs to be a part of this, that needs to be a part of the conversation, and that's really the Pentecostal movement. And there the innovations are, spirit-filled evangelical. They're really focused on addiction recovery rather than just on homelessness. But the huge thing that's about this is if you look at the Pentecostal movement, it now has a number of adherents that's comparable to evangelicals, and there's obviously overlap there, but it's grown hugely in the global South. It's highly entrepreneurial. So if you look at Teen Challenge, it's founded in 1960. There's now 1,400 sites with them. Dream Centers by Barnett in 1994, 84 sites. And I think that's worth really paying attention to and trying to figure out how can we learn from each other in that. So we have these different theological streams, and I put them kind of into categories. So if you look over here, independent missions, entirely privately funded, are the most theologically conservative. And then you have independent missions with some government funding. The centralized missions often have significant government funding, and the quasi-governmental missions are more theologically liberal. And here you have the risk of assimilation. And there you have risk of separation and irrelevance. And here you have very strong boundaries around your faith, whereas there you're going to be much more flexible. So we've done a lot of research on the different global city missions. I showed you the database. So here's what we found out there, and I'd love to have you add to this. And a lot of this depends on how you define the missions, but there's two in Africa, Australia and Oceania 18, continental Europe 52, North America 482, UK and Ireland 18, and then Asia and Latin America right now. I'm not familiar with any that are affiliating with that movement. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of groups out there that are doing similar work, but it just hasn't really affiliated with a larger movement. And you can kind of see the relative size here. I kept the currencies, but you can see that the U.S. and the continental Europe are the biggest. But this is a little bit misleading because a lot of these, part of the reason why that's so big is because a lot of those are the quasi-governmental missions, and there's kind of a question of are they still similar to the rest of the missions, because if they're a branch of the government, that makes them something very different. Now, one way is to look at this is by location, the other is by network or association. So you have the Salvation Army, and so there's thousands of sites, around 8 billion in revenue. Citygate Network has about 2 billion in revenue with its members. Adult and Teen Challenge, 1,400 sites, around 400 to 500 million. Mission Australia is in Australia dollars about 205 million, Dream Center Network around 100 million, and CMM-UK 18, and if I'm doing my research right, around 22 million. So I want to focus a lot of this talk on the fourth wave and the importance of investing in networks, because that's a key part of this talk. So the idea of networks and associations is they help accelerate how quickly you're going up. This is an innovation curve. So how quickly you go up this is how quickly you're learning, how quickly you're building a better aircraft. So what happens is, I love the quote from William Gibson. He says, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So there are missions out there that have already peaked. There are others that are fifth wave missions. So and there's emerging practices of the fifth wave. So a lot of my interest is trying to figure out what are these innovations. So how do we promote the innovations on the fourth wave to missions, and then how do we do research to identify the fifth wave? So there's really two domains of innovation. So one is across cultural innovation. So you all are mostly living in a post-Christian context. So a lot of what's needed is cultural innovation. And then you also need organizational innovation and scale. So there's kind of these two dimensions of innovation. So you have contexts that are in a post-Christian context, and then other contexts that are in a strong evangelical base. Now, what I've done is, and you can kind of look at this and you can say, where is your mission? So, okay, we're a smaller mission. We're down here, but we're post-Christian context, right? Or maybe you're a larger mission. You could be, up here. And what we've done is we've identified what are some of the best practice models that are out there that are in post-Christian context. So, one of the models I think that's most interesting for you in the UK is the Scott mission in Canada, because it's not only in a post-Christian context, but there's a stronger welfare state in Canada. But the Scott mission's thriving. It's strongly Christian. It's big. And it can be an interesting model. There's others, like the Springs Rescue Mission, Colorado Springs in Bowery and Manhattan, St. Matthew's House, Seattle. These are post-Christian cities. Denver. A lot of these are written books. You can get access to this presentation from the links provided at the beginning, and then you can check out the books that are out there. And then on where there's a strong evangelical base, these are a lot of these are in the Midwest or in the South. Or just places where there's a lot of evangelicals. So Wheeler Mission in Indianapolis, Open Door Mission in Omaha, these are giants out there. Miracle Hill Ministries, and these are organizations that are growing quickly. Orange County Rescue Mission, Hope Gospel Mission. These are all models to learn from, and so if you're wanting to learn, okay, how do you adapt in a post-Christian context? These have both organizational best practices, but they also have done the post-Christian, language translation. These have done that somewhat, but they're in places where that's not as critical. So really what the fourth wave is about, whenever I show that innovation, it's kind of like, how do you move from the basic airplane to these jumbo jets? And part of what's interesting, if you look at the models of commercial planes, they're all pretty similar. They all are following, basically the same basic designs, over time. And how do you move so you can become one of these jumbo jets? That's I think a part of what we're trying to do now. One of the key tools, so as I mentioned, we teach a lot of courses on this, and one of the key tools is something that's called the sustainability matrix. And what that does is it says, okay, let's take two things on return on investment. You have financial return on investment, and then you have a life transformation return on investment. And you can plot all your activities on this. And then what you do is you get the things that are your stars: high mission impact, high profitability. And then you have high mission impact, low profitability. So this is something you love to do, but it may not, be financially sustainable. And then these are the things you're not doing well and it's not profitable. So what does this mean? So low mission impact, high profitability. So your fundraising, your social enterprises, you're establishing a regional and national brand. This is how you build a jumbo jet. You have to learn to build a jumbo fundraising engine. You have to build jumbo social enterprises, jumbo regional national brands. And those are highly profitable. But then you have programs, and what's happened over time in the U.S., and I noticed that there's a huge difference between U.S. missions and UK missions. 80% of the activities in U.S. missions are all similar, and they're all similar jumbo jet design. So they have three things they do: homeless services, addiction recovery, and spiritual development. And 80% of them do all three of those, and they have big programs in all three of those, and they're all integrated. Um, so a lot of what you have to do is figure out, how do you innovate on these levels? So here's some of the things that have happened in the fourth wave. So highly professionalized fundraising. These are groups that raise billions of dollars. So a network of mission-driven for-profit consultants that raise over $2 billion annually is what's happening with Citygate. Social enterprises, hundreds of thrift stores, and a network of for-profit thrift consultants that help them scale. Food-based social enterprises that are remarkably successful. Other social enterprises. In the U.S., popularizing the rescue mission brand and concept nationally. So that in most major metro areas, rescue missions are in the top 3 nonprofit homeless service providers, and they have widely recognized brands in their city. So the idea is that the rescue mission brand, or a city mission, if you go to another city, a lot of people, will recognize it, going from city to city. Standardization of the best practices. As I mentioned, 80% of rescue missions primarily provide 3 integrated services very well: homeless shelter, addiction recovery, and spiritual discipleship are the 3 things that they do. And they've cut out a lot of the other stuff. And then highly relevant education and training is one of the innovations out of there. So the Citygate conferences and workshops, City Vision University, were one of the innovations that came out of this wave 4. Now, here's a key point that I want to make. Is if you miss a wave or you don't fully participate in a wave, what it means is it means that you just, grow more slowly or decline. So let me talk about what that means in very concrete terms. So I collected data and I looked at the 50 largest missions in the United States, and then where I could get 11-year revenue growth data. And then I divided those into those that are members of Citygate Network and those that aren't members. Now, those that are members over an 11-year period, they almost doubled in size. The non-members increased just a little bit over 50%. So the idea behind this is what I'm saying. If you're building a jumbo jet, you need to be a part of an innovation network where you can learn how to build better jets, how to learn how to build better fundraising, build better programs. So if you don't participate, if you're not fully engaged, then the missions that aren't a part of these networks aren't participating that much. They're not growing as much. Now, the same thing applies with City Vision partnership status. So our partners over 11-year period more than doubled in size. And a lot of the missions that weren't partners, they grew a good amount too. But we like to think that part of what we're doing is we're helping them grow more quickly, and to serve more people by helping, diffuse best practices. Now, what's one of the main points that I'm trying to make? So I've studied UK missions, and probably the most significant thing that I found was you guys are so different from each other. It was kind of shocking to me that you were so different from each other. And I think that one of the reasons for that is if you look at the amount of money that goes into Citygate Network and say City Vision University, and the amount of time that missions in the U.S. are spending, I think on average there's probably 10 times as much resources going towards essentially innovation. How do you make the jets better? And so that's, I think a lot of the CMM-UK missions, CMM-UK as an association hasn't achieved the critical mass that has happened in Citygate Network. So ultimately, one of the key questions I have is how can we help that scale? How can we help the missions in CMM-UK take advantage of more of the best practices that can accelerate innovation and standardization of best practices? Now, let me be more specific around, what am I talking about, with this? And, it's easy to talk about innovations in a general term, but I want to talk about it in a more specific term. Now, we use a competency map at City Vision for our courses, and you can think of these as a map of fourth wave competencies. And this relates to a tool that's called the Competing Values Framework. But most ministries have 4 domains of competency: ministry competencies, administrative, fundraising, and social enterprise. And these are the courses that we offer. And these are the different departments that these courses map to. How strong is your expertise in each of these domains? How strong is your expertise across different aspects of programs? We have 33 addiction counseling courses, 9 trauma-informed courses. How can you strengthen the competency of your staff for this, for things like HR and accounting and project management, and then social enterprise, thrift store management, retail management, and then you have the strategy. How do you bring all this together? Strategic management. So ultimately, what Citygate's doing, what City Vision's doing, is we're trying to improve your competencies, your staff competencies across all these domains. And what we see is the organizations that are growing the best, they have a lot of competency in this. They're hiring staff, they're getting their staff trained at Citygate conferences, at City Vision. And what that does is that allows you to get what Jim Collins calls a growth flywheel. So ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to get increased revenue, improve culture and staffing, improve systems and org capacity, improve program impact, and all that's geared and aligned with your theological vision. And you can use this to kind of create a strategic planning map, and that's actually what we do. Now, ultimately, that's what you're trying to do as an organization whenever you're moving up that innovation curve. You're trying to get competent in all of these 4 domains. So how does a movement happen? Well, if you looked at what happened with Tim Keller and the city movement, well, first he got this flywheel going for Redeemer. He got over 1,000 people, lives being transformed. He recontextualized. He figured out his theological vision. He basically figured out the model, and then he figured out how to replicate the model. Now, a lot of people are trying to replicate before they have their own flywheel going. So what happens, and this is how a new movement happens. So a new movement happens when someone aligns a new theological vision. So Tim Keller got a theological vision for affluent post-Christian societies, and then a ministry expression, a strategy of what God's doing in a particular context in a way that enables it to spread. So this is what we're trying to do. So with that, what are some key recommendations? For CMM-UK, ultimately, I think the number one thing is how do you guys scale and professionalize as an association? Ultimately, you guys got to go back to, one of the first lessons of City Missions was Naismith. He realized that you need full-time people. So hire a staff person who's going to be the CMM-UK coordinator and pay that person. You probably aren't going to be able to pay them that much right now because you don't have that many member missions, but hiring a semi-retired mission leader who especially can help build fundraising capacity of missions. I'm hoping someone will watch this and you'll feel called by God to say, you know what, this is me. because ultimately I think this is how that's going to happen is someone's going to take this and they're saying, you know what, I'm retired from my mission, but I want to build the movement. And I understand I'm not going to get paid like I was as an executive director or as a director of development. So that's number one. Number two is stronger alignment with the Citygate Network and City Vision University. So consider broadening CMM-UK membership to other values-aligned ministries serving the homeless and addicted, even if they don't call themselves city missions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then if you're an individual CMM-UK mission, invest more in fundraising and try to get better at fundraising. Ultimately, that's what you need. So consider increased engagement with development consultants and City Vision's fundraising courses. So it's worth stating that large U.S. missions on average spend 10 to 15% of their budget on fundraising related expenses. So for missions that are primarily dependent on missionary-based self-fundraising model, where each person calls themselves a missionary and has to raise their own funds, you don't want to just get off of that model, but you have to transition over time to have an increased proportion of fundraising to be a centralized professional model. That's the only way you're going to scale. And then you have to use this thing that I showed you, the sustainability metrics and strategic planning, to better focus on programs that are most likely to align with sustainable funding. You have to normalize your airplane. You guys have 15, 18 different types of airplanes, and the way you're going to get better is if you get your airplanes to be a little more similar and better aligned with the winds that are flowing in society right now that will fund your airplane and have it take off, right? And invest more in CMM-UK and learning from other missions. So ultimately, this comes down to, many of you have read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about this P versus PC balance. And, the production, and that's the ministry that we do. And this is what all of us need to work on this. We're all in recovery from something, and many of us, this is our thing. We're in recovery from trying to produce too much all the time. So we're trying to minister too much and not doing enough of the production capacity. He calls this sharpening the saw. So how do you become more effective over the short and long term? My primary diagnosis is that in ministry, we just focus too much on production, the golden egg, and not enough on the goose, production capacity. So ultimately, that's what we need to shift. So one of the recommendations was, expanding CMM-UK. I think one way to do this is to have a concentric circle strategy. So you have city missions, so your 18 city missions. But is there something magical or special about using the word city mission? I don't think so. It's really, is there a values alignment? So you kind of have this second tier of values aligned ministries that are serving, and I like to use the terms homeless and addicted, because usually those are the two common things that at least in the U.S. 80% of missions are doing both of these, and maybe 20% will be doing one of those. I would say in general, most city missions are non-denominational, and they're at least evangelical in their roots. The term evangelical has kind of been canceled thanks to it being co-opted by politicians, especially in the U.S. But the idea is, do you take the Bible seriously? Are you gospel-centered? Are you Christ-centered in what you're doing? And ultimately, I think a key goal is you guys need to get to critical mass. So can you broaden your membership to increase the critical mass? And you may have a third tier there. And then there's going to be others that you say, these folks aren't invited. So I did some research to try to identify those that are aligned with evangelical values. Some of you guys may recognize these. Bethel, Derby City Mission, Barnabas in Manchester, Beacon House, the Keys Project. And this is just some AI research I did. Some of these may not be values aligned. But the idea is thinking about broadening, your definition, so that you come up with a clear definition, so there is values alignment. So you're not trying to secularize, but at the same time, do they call themselves a city mission? There's nothing special about that. So all of this up to now has been focused on the fourth wave. This last part of the presentation, I want to talk about the fifth wave. So ultimately, what are the fifth wave challenges? And I haven't given this a name yet because I think that we see the challenges, and what The solutions are still emerging. So we're still at the early stages of this. But the fifth wave challenges, um, post-Christian societies, obviously a huge one. Demographic shifts. Many of you are in cities where the demographics of who you serve have radically changed really quickly. Political polarization is huge. Another one that may not be as obvious to us, but I think that in Western countries we have to really pay attention to the rise of the global South. So the center of mass of Christianity is now in the global South, in the majority world, and we need to be thinking about that. So all these are in the category of cultural adaptation or cultural innovation. This other category is just what I call complexity. And there's just the complexity of the expanded, all the emerging forms of addiction and mental health crisis that's happening, the impact on immigration, on homelessness, increasing legal and compliance complexity. And what's happening, again, this quote, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So we're all encountering this kind of at different rates. Now, in responding to these challenges, I think there's a few organizational and cultural innovations that are emerging. So emerging organizational innovations. So the answer to complexity, I really think, is scale. I'm honestly, by values, I'm not a big believer in scale, but by strategy, it's the answer to complexity. So in the US, more and more missions are emerging as multi-site or mission alliances. And what's happening is they're getting the scale to handle the complexities of modern missions. So the Rescue Mission Alliance, City Team, Wheeler, and there's a lot of missions that have taken over smaller missions. So I think that's one of the innovations. How can we get good at doing this? In the church world, you have mega churches and you have multi-site churches. So I think that there are some analogs to that for these missions. And then funding, social enterprise driven missions. Ultimately, what's happening is our funding sources over time are going to get more and more threatened. So we need to have funding sources that are resistant to secularizing influences in post-Christian contexts. So there's a lot of missions that the majority of their funding is coming from social enterprises. So St. Matthew's, Miracle Hill, the Foundry Ministries, Faith Farm, and in City Vision, that's one of our core competencies is around social entrepreneurship. And then funding, getting extremely complex, high-scale fundraising. And what that does is that enables the scale needed to handle the complexity. So Denver Rescue Mission is the largest mission in the United States, and their fundraising, there's no easy way to summarize it, but it's high scale. They're getting all the elements they need. A big part of fundraising, if I had to say what's one thing you can do, is focus more on major gifts. As more money is going to fewer people, fundraising unfortunately has to reflect that. So major gifts, planned giving, things along those lines are really important. And then you have emerging cultural innovation. So programs, there's something that I like to call critical mass organizational strategy. And ultimately, we need program models that ultimately will adapt to post-Christian context. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but a lot of it is having tiers of programming and providing more a la carte programming. But I'm not going to go into all the details of that given the time limitation. And one other cultural innovation is just language. So having high fluency in secular counseling / social work, but also having a strong biblical basis. So, Paul was a great missionary, and he put things in the language of those he was serving. And ultimately, that language is changing over time. So how do you present a city mission's impact in language that works with post-Christian context? And a lot of that has to do with secular counseling and social work framework. So Colorado Springs, City Visions, our masters in addiction counseling, that's a big focus of that. So this book, Meeting Homelessness with Hope, is a lot of the story of the Colorado Springs mission, which is a good model for that. So that gets into kind of this question of two dimensions of contextualizing. So one of the challenges we have is we're contextualizing both to a post-Christian and also to serving the poor. So, is it important to recontextualize for a post-Christian society? Well, there, Tim Keller has probably the best model that at least is well known for targeting upper middle class contextualization. Now, if you're familiar with the coffee brand Starbucks, that's what they're trying to do. They kind of have the upscale coffee brand. But then you have indigenous contextualization, professionalization. So, in the United States, we have a coffee brand that's more the working class coffee brand called Dunkin' Donuts. I tried to find what's the equivalent of that in the UK, and at least AI thought it was Greg. So you can tell me whether that's the case. But that's really what we're trying to do with City Vision, is we're trying to say, okay, how can we help you contextualize to a post-Christian context, but also serving the poor, so you're not kind of, contextualizing across one dimension or another. Now, if neither of these is important, so there's two questions. Is it important to contextualize? You're basically dysfunctional because you're not aligned with either cultural dimension. But a lot of old school missions, they're in the U.S. we call them traditional missions or ma and pa missions, and in many cases these were ministries of the poor, and those aren't thriving as much now, and a lot of it is just there's a lot more sophistication that's needed. So I'm going to go into some of the resources that City Vision offers that you guys can build from. So what we're trying to do at City Vision is, so we have these 600 partner meetings and interviews. We have over 100 books that we're digitizing on missions, thousands of articles and documents on missions. We have 25 faculty from missions and a research database of 565 plus missions that we're adding, and it's not just a database that the public side that you see. We have a lot of data on different missions, so we're trying to do this practical research, and then we're making that a lot of that available through these free resources: our newsletter, our podcast, our AI research archive and toolkit, and then we have and these are all free. We have courses and programs. So I showed you kind of our courses map. You can go to our website to see that, but on our programs for degrees, we have 4 main degrees: addiction counseling, nonprofit management, business administration, ministry and leadership. And we offer those at 5 levels. And then we have 5 specialty certificates: nonprofit fundraising, food services, retail management, facilities management, and recovery coaching. And for everyone outside the US, it's going to be $550 per course. So our goal isn't to make money. I mean, we're a ministry. I could have made a lot more money if I stayed in the .com world. Our goal is to help you guys, to help build your capacity. So here's some potential next steps with City Vision. You can take advantage of our free resources. So our newsletter is at rescuemissions.cityvision.edu. You can listen to our podcast if you search for the Rescue Mission Report. You can meet with us. So send us an email at partnerships@cityvision.edu, or you can set up a meeting. We'll give you free support and advice. Help us with research. If you have a book on your mission, we're trying to digitize all the books that we can. So send us a copy. Send us an email to this address, and then we can digitize it, or you can digitize it yourself. And also help us identify additional missions and make introductions. So I know that there's a lot more missions than are just members of CMM-UK. And we want to have an ongoing dialogue on the movement. View City Vision as another resource, just like CMM-UK or the Citygate Network. We exist to support the global city mission movement, and we want to work with you in how to do that. So one other thing is we also are hoping to have a fundraising course cohort. And whenever I look at a lot of the UK missions, one of the biggest things they need is funding. So we want to help just build the capacity of CMM-UK mission. So if you or someone from your organization might like to be a part of an 8-week fundraising course cohort, send us an email. If you're at the conference, you can talk to Dick McMillan, or you can send us an email at partnerships@cityvision.edu. We probably will set up an initial Zoom call where you can find out more about it. And really the benefit is you're going to work with a fundraising consultant that normally charges $5,000 a month to work with you, and you're going to get 2 months to work with them. You're going to work in a cohort exclusively on CMM-UK missions. Here's the cost. The biggest cost is going to be time. It takes a lot of time to do this. So it's going to be about 15 hours a week for 8 weeks. It's all asynchronous. You can do it whenever you want, except we'll probably do 4 live Zoom meetings in total. The normal cost for UK missions would be $600, so that's $550 plus per term $50 fee. But honestly, I just want to work with you guys. I want to support you. So we'll provide it for whatever you're willing to pay. We do like for people to pay something because we find otherwise they don't put in the effort. And the faculty is going to be putting in the effort, so we want to make sure that the students are putting in the effort to make sure there's a commitment. And the last thing, if this what I'm teaching about is really of interest to you, we have a course that is the primary focus of that course. It's called Aligning Strategy with Theology and Values. You have to have a bachelor's degree to take this course. And it's recommended for people who are in executive leadership. It's going to be starting in January. You can find out about it, on our website. It's called Men 640. And a lot of it is how do you recontextualize your ministry, using a lot of the tools that we have, and how do you do that without secularizing? Because it's, like I said at the very beginning, it's really easy to innovate. And a lot of, missions and a lot of ministries, they're cautious about the word innovation because even things like the emerging church, a lot of the emerging church, that movement really secularized. And, everything that's new isn't great. So you have to really think deeply around, how do you innovate without secularizing? That's really the main focus of this course. So hopefully all this has been helpful for you. And I look forward to connecting with more and more folks from your missions.